It's just great to have you with us, and it is a privilege to be here on what always was and always will be Aboriginal country. Well, this is an Anzac Day like no any other in living memory. Normally, on this day of all days, we gather together, families and veterans, young and old, from communities great and small all across our nation. We come together, I think, to do the work of remembrance, and memorials like this one are piled high with our wreaths and our offerings. And really, for over 100 years now, Anzac Day has been a time for community. We thought we might begin with these images of early Anzac Days. In this case, it's from Melbourne in the 1920s, as you can see, but you'll find similar images right across Australia. On Anzac Day, people gather around memorials. Returned men and women march through streets and towns, and fathers like this one lift their young ones up to watch that passing parade. A single line says it all, doesn't it? Little Miss Rosemary, the child in that soldier's arms, is called, we're told, and she's waiting to place a posse of flowers on what was then Victoria's State Memorial. Alas, we can't do that today. COVID-19 means we can't come together in friendship or in fellowship. But we can join one another as a kind of virtual community. And that's really the purpose of today's broadcast from your national university. As historians, we can tell you lots about those early Anzac Days and the shifting meanings that are embodied in our war memorials. But really, most of all, we want to hear from you. Why not drop us a line and tell us how you've marked Anzac Day, this morning. You probably couldn't visit your town memorial, not unless it was part of a permissible exercise circuit, but maybe you devised your own inventive act of remembrance. Maybe you found an old photograph of a family member who went to war. Perhaps you took the time to read from a letter or from a diary. And some of you probably fashioned a memorial all of your own, a posy of flowers like Miss Rosemary carried that day. And of course, wild rosemary grows to this day on the slopes of Gallipoli. Today's Anzac Day has certainly been a challenge for us all. But let's remember the private family-based commemoration we've been observing this year actually rekindles an older and maybe a more intimate mode of remembrance. The first Anzac Days, which were held well before the war was over, were nowhere near as orchestrated or as organised as we've seen in recent years. And let's remember too that other generations of Australians have faced similar challenges on Anzac Day before us. Large public gatherings were banned during the Second World War as well. And actually, the very first Anzac Day after the war was held in the midst of a pandemic just as terrible as the one we're living through today. Now, this is an Anzac Day image from 1919 in Sydney. Many public ceremonies were cancelled right across Australia, but this one, it went ahead regardless. And as you can see, people in this image are wearing masks, the only protection they had against the scourge of what they called the Spanish flu. That first great pandemic in our history claimed the lives of perhaps as many as 15,000 Australians. Perhaps 100 million succumbed to the flu the world over. In the end, that strain of influenza would kill more people than the war itself. And like the war, that virus afflicted the young first and foremost. So, perhaps this Anzac Day, we should remember the ordeal of Anzac Days past. Imagine those men and women sailing home, survivors of 4 years of fighting, only to die within sat on our shores or to perish in quarantine stations dotted around the country. The image I'm showing you now is of HMAT Boona. It's the troop transport that carried the flu to Western Australia. Now, the Boona was as notorious in 1919 as the Ruby Princess is today. Over 30 passengers and crew would perish by the time the virus was actually contained. The vessel was described as a floating hell, and it was turned away from one port after another. Then, as today, the sick and the dying were tended to by a group of exceptionally brave and exceptionally dedicated individuals. 20 Australian nurses, originally posted to field hospitals in Salonika, volunteered in Durban to sail home with the troops, knowing that every moment on that ship would place their own lives in jeopardy. 3 members of the Australian Army Nursing Service would die before the year was out, and they were just as much a casualty of that war as any soldier on the battlefield. And really, we can go further than that, can't we? Soon it was all health workers, not just military personnel, who were in the front line of fire. Hilda Williams here was one of several civilian nurses who volunteered to nurse those stricken soldiers on the Boona. Within a matter of weeks, her mother received a telegram. Her daughter was dead, taken by a pandemic that would lay low a generation. Now, that was the second such telegram Mrs. Williams received in the course of the Great War. In 1916, her only son had been killed at Pozières, a battlefield on the other side of the war. And in 1919, long after the guns fell silent in France, the war had claimed her daughter also, and within just a few miles of the home that she'd been raised in. Perhaps then, this Anzac Day, we do widen the ambit of remembrance. The cost of war, the pain of war, is never just borne by men and women in uniform. I want to go back to that moment in Anzac Day in Sydney in 1919 for just a second, because it offers another opportunity for you to take part in this discussion. Now, that image is telling us 2 important things about what we might call our country's commemorative culture. It offers us an insight into the form and the location of Australia's war memorials. Let's talk about location first. This is where one of the first memorials was raised in Sydney, and this is where the community, on that first Anzac Day after the war, chose to gather together and remember. The woman you can see here is pinning flowers to the gates that surround the walls at Woolloomooloo, and I'm sure you can guess why. Through those gates, someone close to her, a husband or a brother, a cousin or an uncle, marched off to war and did not march home again. Through those gates, this woman saw that man sail away across the ocean and into eternity. So where we place our memorials is really just as important as the way we actually build them. Where did your community choose to raise its war memorial? A quiet garden reserve or a busy intersection? At the centre of your community, or maybe carefully, deliberately set aside from the hustle and bustle of day-to-day life? In short, is your memorial a civic centrepiece or a sanctuary, or is it both? Why not drop us a line and we can take up that conversation? And please say who you are. First name is fine, and of course the hometown you're writing from. Let's turn now to the physical form these first memorials took. I think you can sense the spontaneity in that early Sydney memorial. Those makeshift reeds pinned to those gates were simple, heartfelt tributes from those who felt the need to grieve. It wasn't until the 1920s that we really set about building permanent memorials in earnest. And all of those monuments differ in shape, in size, and in symbolism. Now, this is the memorial that now stands at Woolloomooloo. It features that image of rosemary, the emblem of the Anzac Fellowship of Women, and of course a symbol of remembrance from Shakespeare to today. The memorial, as you can see, is both ornamental, but it's functional. It's a water fountain. You can drink from it. And you can read so much into that symbolism. Water as the renewal of life. Water as cleansing and purifying. The gentle sound of water offers us solace. And water reminds us of those greater waters that carried those men and women away. On monuments like this one, we inscribed words like everlasting. We built them of bronze and of stone, hoping that they would outlast the ages. Never, as the architect of one of our greatest war memorials put it, to weather and decay. But in fact, the form, the meaning, and even the location of memorials changes constantly, historically, over time. And you can see that, can't you, at Woolloomooloo? From those simple, fragile, perishable wreaths to that elaborate tribute from soldiers' wives and mothers. Originally, the new memorial was positioned at that point of farewell, where families watched their loved ones sail away. But as a naval base grew up around it, the stonework, and the plumbing for that matter, was repositioned and rededicated several metres down the road. And that brings me to yet more questions I'd like to ask you. What form does your town's memorial take? Obelisk or arch? The statue of a soldier or a simple solemn pillar? Perhaps a garden of remembrance? Perhaps a very utilitarian memorial, like a fountain or a hall or even a school? How has the location, the function, even the position of your memorial changed over time? Now, in the course of the Anzac Centenary, hundreds of communities across Australia rebuilt and often extended their war memorials. It was a great labour of remembrance that historians of the future do need to understand. We'd love to hear your thoughts on that today. For now, it's time for us to move on. And I mean move on quite literally. One of the really difficult things about this pandemic has been confinement. Australians who love to range the length and the breadth of this beautiful country have locked themselves in at home. And so we must, if we're to stem the spread of infection and beat this disease. But just as we can gather together as a virtual community, we can embark on a virtual journey as well. So join me for just the next few minutes on a tour of Australia's commemorative landscape. We begin in Sydney, we move on to South Australia, and we take in bits of Tasmania and Victoria on the way. I'm joined here by my colleague and the co-presenter of Australian Journey, Dr. Susan Carland.
Anzac might seem like a myth that privileges men, and yet here at the Anzac Memorial, right in the centre, is this remarkable sculpture by Raynor Hoff called Sacrifice. Raynor was a veteran himself, and he'd seen far too much of war to ever want to glorify it. But arguably, this memorial doesn't pay tribute to martial virtues. It embodies loss. Those three figures, a wife, a mother, a daughter, carry a slain soldier on his shield. He's far from the usual caricature of an Anzac, some sort of superhuman warrior. This man is a victim rather than a fighter. His nakedness connotes his vulnerability. And perhaps this memorial embodies another message as well. The cost of war isn't confined to the men sent to fight it. Its pain is carried by families and communities as well.
Raynor Hoff's compelling sculpture is our object for this week's episode. And really, memorials like this one are scattered all across the Australian landscape. It's been argued that Australians raise more war memorials per head of population than any other nation in the world. And the question for us really is why? To answer that question, we'll be travelling thousands of kilometres from here to South Australia and the Women's Memorial Gardens in Adelaide.
This is Adelaide, the capital of South Australia and one of the country's most beautiful cities. Adelaide is known as the City of Churches, but it's also a vibrant centre of the arts, the gateway to the Barossa Valley, and a metropolis ringed by gardens and lakes and parks.
Within just a kilometre of here, we found no fewer than 4 major war memorials. Another Raynor Hoff, South Australia's State Memorial, a monument to Australia's black diggers, and this tribute to Simpson and his donkey, the Great War's humblest hero, a medic who carried the wounded to safety on the perilous slopes of Gallipoli.
This is the 4th memorial we've found today, and it's the most eloquent. Why? Because these Women's Memorial Gardens, not far from Adelaide's great cathedral, answers that question we posed back in Sydney, which is, why are there so many war memorials raised the length and breadth of Australia?
You know, it's not just the scale of the carnage, though that was terrible enough. In the early 20th century, and still today, laying a body to rest is an integral part in the whole process of mourning. Time-honoured rituals revolved around a loved one's physical remains, empowering families in the face of loss, offering solace and sometimes acceptance. But unlike France or the United States, who repatriated their war dead, Australia's fallen were buried overseas. And unlike Great Britain, those graves were oceans and oceans away, not just a short trip across the Channel.
Most Australians could never afford to visit battlefields or cemeteries overseas, so they had no way of physically connecting with the faraway lands and places that had claimed their loved ones. All they could do was imagine them.
And so it's not surprising, really, that the Women's Memorial Gardens here in Adelaide takes the form of a graveyard. Flower beds of roses are made out to resemble plots. They're symbolising actual graves in France or Gallipoli, Palestine or Belgium. A stone of remembrance lies at one end of these gardens, a cross of sacrifice at the other. Those same memorial forms mark the Great War's cemeteries all across Europe. So, by walking through this garden of remembrance, families felt the presence of those distant dead. This place enabled a kind of imaginary pilgrimage.
And so too, in a sense, does every war memorial. Whatever form they took, obelisk or arch, a cross or a statue, all these war memorials had one thing in common. All were called a cenotaph, literally an empty grave. These were the surrogate tombs of loved ones, buried thousands of miles away. They offered a place to grieve and a focus for our mourning. And one of the largest and grandest of these memorials lies at the very heart of the nation.
Well, thanks to my colleagues at Monash, the National Museum of Australia and, of course, the ANU for making that documentary possible. I hope that clip gives you some sort of insight into Australia's commemorative landscape. And I wonder if some of the memorials you saw there actually reminded you of your own. If I played more of that documentary, we'd end up here in Canberra, in the galleries of the Australian War Memorial, one of our country's greatest commemorative complexes, where Anzac Day, despite all the challenges, was actually observed today. But I thought I'd end this presentation with a far smaller, far more modest monument. It stands at the centre of a little country town called Meeniyan in southeast Gippsland. Small and simple it may be, but I think the message it carries is complex and immense. And again, it facilitates a kind of imaginary journey. Let's take a closer look at it. Here it is, flanked by puppies and the public that first Anzac Day last year. A simple broken pillar, and we'll discover in a minute what that signifies. Hundreds of young men from the district went off to war. Farmers, labourers, a carpenter, a clerk. Dozens never returned. Their names are carved in gold, and though no one stands by those names today, they glisten nonetheless in the sun. One particular name is of special interest to us. Tom Murray, a grazier from Buffalo, who lost his life in the Dardanelles in 1915. So let's embark on a second Australian journey now. Let's learn the story of Tom, the community that grieved for him, and the father who made that first painful pilgrimage to Gallipoli. This time, we're joined by Dr. Beck Wheatley. Now, Beck earned her doctorate at the ANU with a thesis examining the meaning of Anzac amongst the young. This very short clip begins and ends at the most imposing war memorial Australia would build, Victoria's Shrine of Remembrance in Melbourne.
My name's Rebecca Wheatley, and I've always wanted to travel to Gallipoli to see the place where this boat went ashore in 1915. And ever since I saw Russell Crowe's film The Water Diviner, I've wondered if the story could be true. An Australian farmer who travels to Gallipoli in search for his lost son nearly 100 years ago. Today I'll be speaking with Professor Bruce Skates, an expert on those first Australian journeys to battlefields overseas. I'll find Bruce at the State Library of Victoria, where one of Australia's richest collections on the Great War is held, and together we will solve the mystery of the Water Diviner. The Water Diviner is all about the story of the missing. Why were so many men missing, Bruce? Why were so many bodies never found?
What you've got to remember about Gallipoli, Beck, is it's chaos. It's chaos and it's carnage. Nobody expected a terrain like the terrain they found at Gallipoli. Nobody expected those crazy ridges, those crazy gullies. Men are simply swallowed up by that landscape. They're missing out on the ridges and they're not actually brought in, they're not recovered till well after the war in many cases, and those men, of course, can never ever be identified.
In the film The Water Diviner, the father believes that maybe his son survived the war, that he was wounded and taken prisoner. Was that even remotely a possibility, and did families believe that that could have happened to their son?
Yes, many did. They go on hoping against hope, even though not many prisoners were actually taken. But what's so interesting about The Water Diviner is I think it's actually based on a piece of history. This is a picture of Mr. and Mrs. Irwin, and they're making their journey to Gallipoli way back in 1926. And what's so interesting about this illustration is the story behind it. Mrs. Irwin starts writing to the Red Cross Wounded and Missing way back in 1916. My son, she says, you've never found the body. My son may be found. Maybe he's lost his memory, maybe he's taken prisoner. And she goes on writing like that and hoping like that and praying like that well into the 1920s. And in 1926, she's one of the first Australian pilgrims to make that journey to Gallipoli.
Did many families make that journey in the 1920s?
No, very, very few. And that's not surprising because it was so expensive. What we have here, Beck, is a photograph album from the 1920s, and it's really quite rare and it's really quite extraordinary. It charts one of those early journeys to Gallipoli. It costs £100 sterling for a family to make their way to Anzac. And just to put that in context for you, that's a year's wages for a skilled white male worker. So it's really only the elite, like this woman, who can afford to make that particular journey. And one of the remarkable features of this album is it captures those images of Gallipoli in the 1920s, before the beach at Anzac Cove has been swept away. So this is really a rare and precious image of what Gallipoli used to look like. And we see them making their way up to Chunuk Bair, where the great memorial, the New Zealand memorial, is unveiled in 1925. And a pilgrimage in the 1920s, it's very different to a backpacker tour of today. There are no roads at Gallipoli. People make their way up to the ridges in horses and carts. This is a difficult journey. It's especially difficult for those old parents of the men who actually died.
The Irwins went to Gallipoli in 1926 and the Grimwades go in 1923, but the film is set well before that, before the cemeteries are completed and when Turkey is again at war, this time with Greece. It sounds like an impossible journey. Can historians prove that one actually took place?
I think we can, and in fact The Water Diviner is based on a small fragment of history. This is Gallipoli Mission, and it's Bean's account of what Gallipoli is like in 1919, 1920. And there's a remarkable letter that's written by Cyril Hughes. Cyril Hughes has stayed on at Anzac to bring in the bodies of his mates. Cyril Hughes did fight there, and he stays on at Gallipoli to bury those men decently. And what does he say? An old man came here, he says. The sights of the peninsula are unspeakably distressing. We did what we could for him, and then we send him on his way. And it's this fragment of evidence that the whole film is based around.
So how do we discover that man's name?
Well, virtually all the Australians who went to Europe in the 1920s passed through London. And when they're in London, they often keep a record of their journey. They visit Australia House, they sign the visitors' book there, and they provide us with a kind of itinerary, an itinerary of what they're doing. They recorded their journey for posterity, and we can find a record of that itinerary here in this very library. This journal's called the British Australasian, and I guess it's a kind of newsletter for the expatriate community, that huge community of Australians and New Zealanders who are living in London. And in these pages, these fragile, dusty pages, we can find the record of that journey.
Mr. Thomas Murray has arrived from Victoria with the object of visiting the grave of his son, who fell in the charge of the 8th Light Horse at Walker's Ridge, Gallipoli, and the graves of other relatives in France. But can we trust a newspaper account like this?
Well, the dates are roughly aligned, and I think that description is just about picture perfect. The service records of the Anzacs are now available online at the National Archives, and we can check the records of Murray's son. This is the record for Thomas Richard Murray, Thomas Murray's son. Young Tom's a farmer. just like his father. The two men worked the land together, an extensive grazing property between Buffalo and Fish Creek. And like his father, Tom is intensely patriotic. He joins up in November 1914, right at the beginning of the war. Tom dies on Gallipoli 10 months later. He's reported killed in action on Walker's Ridge. Tom's in his early 20s when he dies, and it's hard for a father to accept the loss of a son anyway, but to lose a boy that young is devastating for Mr. Murray. This is a letter he writes to Base Records in September 1915. That's almost a month after that savage fighting on Walker's Ridge. My son served in the 8th Light Horse, he writes, but his service record, it was altered from 700 to 766. Is there any possibility a mistake could have arisen in consequence of that change in number? We don't know how long Thomas Murray clung to that tiny thread of hope, Beck, but what we do know is that he passionately loved his son.
But could a mistake with identity tags have happened? Could Tom, like the character in the film, have been wounded and taken prisoner?
Well, I think that's where the film really departs from history, Beck, because the charge that they're talking about on Walker's Ridge, that's the attack at the neck. 2 waves of the 8th Light Horse are sent over the top, and they're cut down by machine gun fire within yards of the trenches. It's slaughter at the neck. It's a slaughter that's immortalised in Lambert's painting and in Peter Weir's film Gallipoli. Many men are killed, many are badly wounded, but none are actually taken prisoner. So Tom Murray's remains are buried in a mass grave amongst hundreds of others. The bones of those men weren't recovered until 1919, and by then, of course, very few could be identified.
So Thomas Murray never found his son?
No, I'm afraid not. That's Hollywood, it's not history. There's no Australian soldiers swirling with the Sufis, there's no love interest with a dark-eyed Turkish woman. In a way, what the film does is it offers us a false hope just like those Red Cross wounded and missing files did.
Where else is Thomas Murray remembered?
He's remembered, of course, in the cemetery at Lone Pine, not far from where he lost his life, up there on the ridges. He's remembered there in stone. His name's carved on that great wall to the missing. And his name's inscribed in parchment here, written in parchment in the Shrine of Remembrance. I guess Beck will never know if Thomas Murray really came to terms with his loss after that terrible journey to Gallipoli. We know that he returned to Australia, and we know he continued to work the family farm there. We know he would have seen his son's name. It was etched in gold on the War Memorial in Meeniyan. A few hundred men from the district volunteered for service overseas with Tom, and 55 of them, they never came home. So that memorial in Meeniyan takes the form of a broken column. It symbolises a life cut short, much like young Tom's. And we know that the old man who made his way to Gallipoli outlived his son by 24 years. That's a long time, isn't it, to carry all that grief? But perhaps the epitaph on Thomas Murray's grave in Leongatha really says it all. In loving memory of our dear father. That love sent him halfway across the globe in search of the grave of his son. And perhaps the date of Thomas Murray's death is particularly poignant. Murray sacrificed his son in the Great War, the war to end all wars he was promised. And in 1939, the year that Thomas Murray dies, the world goes to war again.
That must have been devastating for Thomas Murray to know his son died in that futile charge at the neck, and then to discover that the war itself was futile. It's such a waste.
Yes, and in fact I think it's the story of an entire generation, Beck. Look at all these names. Think of all the names carved in all the memorials the world over. And really it's the same story, isn't it? It's fathers without sons, and it's sons without fathers.
Thanks for staying with us, and high-resolution versions of those clips will be available to you very, very soon. I've been watching your responses flooding in. Thank you so much for your engagement, and I'm going to be spending, I think, much of Anzac Day answering you. But let's just take a few of them now. I've got Barcaldine, a township, of course, in Queensland, a very significant site for the Labor movement. The memorial there, I'm told by James, is a white marble clock, and that was decided by public ballot in 1922. It's a beautiful piece. Look, I couldn't agree more. It's interesting how often clocks are chosen as war memorials. I think for a number of reasons. One is, of course, the utilitarian one. They serve a purpose. They tell the community the time. So they're a civic memorial in that sense. But more than that, they signify, don't they, something deeper. They signify the passing of time. And indeed, some clocks are inscribed with the words Anzac. And I remember a case of one memorial in New South Wales, I think, where the clock is actually frozen in time at the hour of the landing. So that's a really significant gesture, isn't it, that we can freeze time, that we can stall, if you like, the work of forgetting. Thank you, James. It's a thoughtful comment. I've got Jim here, who's from a little country town, Foster in Gippsland, and that has a clock tower as well. Now, I know this memorial quite well, and indeed the word Anzac is inscribed on that particular clock face. What's interesting is that Jim thinks that originally it was just a tower and then the clock was added after. And I think that's interesting, isn't it? You've got a memorial that begins purely as a monumental statement, and it's developed later on to serve a civic purpose. That tells us something very important, I think, about memorial culture. You may not know this, but in the 1980s, there was a big debate at Melbourne's Shrine of Remembrance. The shrine had been set up as a sacred place. It wasn't to serve any utilitarian function at all. It was a memorial, a special place that people would go to grieve, where they would make a pilgrimage to. There was actually a debate over whether the shrine should take on an educational purpose as well, whether it should change its original mission. Today, of course, we all know about the huge development that's gone on at the shrine and other great state memorials, the establishment of galleries, interpretive exhibitions and so on are staged there, and they serve now an educational function. So it's interesting, as Jim's saying, that little town in Foster changed its memorial to serve a civic purpose, and our great state memorials, they change as well. Can I just add, I passed Foster just the other day, and I noticed that all around the memorial there are a cluster of memorials. What the community has done is they've raised crosses symbolising the number of men and women who were actually killed overseas. So that engagement with the memorial is an ongoing process. Okay, now I've got a statement here from Nerang on the Gold Coast. Just moving down here. Yes, the Gold Coast of Queensland. It's been refurbished. The cenotaph was placed there at the RSL. There's a memorial garden and a plaque as well. And a dawn ceremony is normally held there with images projected on the walls as a backdrop. And that's from Desiree. Thank you, Desiree, in Queensland. This is really interesting, isn't it? Because we think of these monuments as being timeless statements. We think of them as being elegant statements in stone and having a kind of classical antecedents. And yet what we're getting, what we've seen, I think, all through the course of the centenary is the way that memorials are becoming more and more technological. The Anzac Day I went to previous to last year's was at Villers-Bretonneux. And what I witnessed there was really quite remarkable. The images of soldiers being projected on Luchan's great white tower in the background. So this kind of engagement with the memorial as a theatrical site, if you like, a stage where we can enact, perform remembrance, this is something really quite new, and it's aided, it's been accelerated through technology during the whole course of the centenary. So I think there's a lot of this going on in towns right across Australia. I've got a statement here from Jessica in Windsor in Brisbane. Her memorial is on the hill with the city in the background. It was unveiled on Anzac Day in 1925. Thank you so much, Jessica. One of the comments that Jay Winter makes about memorials is that they have to be visible. They must be seen. We can't just grieve, we must be seen to be grieving. And by having that memorial always within the sight of the community, elevated up there on the hill, that's making a very perfect statement, isn't it? It's reminding us of the imperative to remember, lest we forget. And if I can again allude to the Shrine of Remembrance in Victoria, there, lest we forget is meant in a very literal way. There's actually government legislation that's introduced to prevent blocking the sightline of the shrine. You can see the shrine from the streets of Melbourne. Stand outside the State Library and you will see the shrine. And what's interesting is that the view of the shrine that you used to have was even more complete than that. The shrine was the first thing that people would see when they sailed into Melbourne, as many did, and it was the last thing that they would see as they left. Now, of course, the shrine's ringed by high-rise buildings, so you've lost that sightline. But that precious sightline down St Kilda Road has actually been kept. So visibility is tremendously important. A great point there. Thank you. Hazel, non-Australian is impressed by how modern Australians honour Anzac Day and have expanded their narratives. I visited memorials and left feeling mourning like the loss of my own. That's a really thoughtful question, Andrea, and it's reminding us of something terribly important. I think we diminish ourselves as Australians when we view Anzac Day through a narrow nationalistic prism. I think probably what Anzac Day should remind us of is not national achievement so much as a universal loss, the loss our country felt in war. And it's a loss that's shared by all nations that engage in wars. And that makes the message of Anzac Day relevant to a much wider community than simply the people who were born here or who adopt Australia as their home. So it's a universal message, I think, about mourning and loss and hopefully the futility of war as well. Deborah's writing to us, and she's asked about the commemoration of Anzac changing so much over the decades. It was very quiet. It was very quiet and personal in my childhood in the 70s and 80s. You're right about that, Deborah. I think the way that Anzac Day has changed is really, really interesting. If I can go right back to the very first Anzac Days, and they, of course, are held even before the war is over, and they're very much private ceremonies to begin with in most instances. Groups like the Anzac Fellowship of Women gather together and they make what they call pilgrimages to the graves of wounded soldiers who died after returning to Australia. They hold ceremonies in churches as well. And within family homes, there we have an even more intimate pattern of remembrance. People piece together diaries and letters. They take the medallions, the dead man's penny as they're called, and they construct these private shrines. The mourning is very individual and it's focused in quite an intimate way. You see, I think in the course of the 20th century is a drift away from that kind of private pattern of grieving to what historians have called a much more explicit grief. And indeed, I think what we've seen during the years of the centenary is that Anzac Day is more and more orchestrated from above. And it's not surprising given how large these ceremonies have become. There's more and more of a template, a pattern for remembrance. So those quiet and personal services that Deborah remembers from the 70s and 80s are very different, I think, to the services that we're seeing today. But what I should emphasise too is that there's an emotional range in all of these services. Indeed, there's no single part of Anzac Day that seems to me to be the same. Okay, Thomas, we have a stone sculpture here in Mitcham in Victoria, a stone sculpture of a soldier. Yes, look, I think in Ken Inglis's remarkable tally of war memorials in the Australian landscape, soldiers come in at about third. There's pillars, first of all, obelisks, and then finally there's the soldier himself. And what's interesting about these soldiers is that they're mass manufactured. The reason there's so many of them is that enterprising stonemasons see a market here. Many of them are imported from Italy, and indeed there's one town in particular that supplies dozens of the stone soldiers standing mute in townships across Queensland. So I guess that's an important point to make, isn't it? The structure of memorials is decided not just by how communities feel and what they invest in them, but also by commercial imperatives, the infrastructure, if you like, around the commemorative industry. What I find fascinating about those stone soldiers, and I think it's extremely eloquent when you see one of those stone diggers standing in a town, is their remarkable variety, that range of emotional expression, some solemn symbols of mourning, some quite active. So the stone soldier itself is not a static form at all. I've got Audrey here now. Audrey is from Xavier College, which has a memorial chapel where her father works, and it's still functioning as a sacred place as well as a place of remembrance. Sacred Place, that is in fact the title of Ken Inglis's prize-winning book looking at the history of war memorials in Australia, which I warmly recommend to all of you. And I think that word sacred is tremendously important. I mean, we are living today in a very secular age in many instances, and yet I think we're also reaching in Anzac Day for other ways of believing, a recognition, if you like, that there is something greater than all of us working here. It's interesting that the purpose of that memorial chapel hasn't changed. These places were established as sites to grieve, as sites to mourn, as sites to take stock, and also sites to support one another, and they remain that to this day. I was very privileged to join a group of students from Xavier College on Gallipoli several years ago now, and what those individual students have done is they individualised the story of Anzac. What they had done is they'd researched the name and history of a soldier who had died from their school, and they carried out services at the graves themselves in commemoration of those individuals, but also of the communities. This was a story of a mother's loss, a father's loss, a township's loss, and I think that's tremendously important. And I guess I'd say something more about this, and that's how lucky we are here in Australia, because one of the reasons I think that we've seen this revival of remembrance in our country is that it's possible to give these names a context. My grandfather fought during the First World War, but he served with British forces, and like so many of the records of the British forces, his were lost during the Blitz. So there's no way I can reconstruct the story of his war service. Now, had he been in the Australian service, I have not just the war service dossier, I have a repatriation telling the post-war story. And what I think is really important about that is the possibility it gives us to recreate, if you like, the lives of these men. We have to remember that the Australian Imperial Force was one of the most literate fighting forces in the world, and they've left us a remarkable record. So being able to research the lives of these men through great institutions like our libraries and, of course, the National Archives gives us a chance to individualise them and to take them out of the anonymity of mass death, which is the reality of the Great War. Sophie from Yass, how many bodies of soldiers actually did get back after Gallipoli? How did that happen? That's a really interesting question, Sophie. One soldier is repatriated, the body of one soldier is repatriated from Gallipoli, and that soldier is an officer, General Bridges. Bridges dies in May. He is buried initially in Egypt, and the body is exhumed and brought home to Australia, and it's buried with great pomp and ceremony. Immediately in the vicinity of Duntroon, of course, the military college that he helped to establish. Now, what's important here is that this was a privilege enjoyed by one man, an officer. The reality of it is that most Australians, well, all Australians bar the unknown soldier and Bridges, remain in those graves overseas. Why is that? That's because Australia follows a decision that's made in Britain. In the early days of the war, what actually happened is that British families did exhume the bodies of the war dead long before the fighting was over. And that, of course, was a horrendous exercise. It was also posing enormous problems transporting the bodies of the dead when the imperative, of course, was to fight and to win the war. So the government placed a simple ban in place. There would be no repatriation of the war dead. And after a while, this became a very democratic statement. I mean, it was only the very, very rich who could afford that procedure. So if a democratic army was to suffer equally, then so too families must bear an equal burden in that kind of burden of remembrance, of grieving. No one would be privileged to bring home the bodies of their loved ones. So that statement was made. Now, what's really important about this is that there was opposition, tremendous opposition. Many families felt that they should have had that right. After the war, the lobbying resumes. Now, surely we can bring home our dead. And moreover, this kind of democratic impulse with the Imperial War Memorial Commission, the Imperial War Graves Commission, runs even deeper than that. They also ban what they call private memorials. That's why every tombstone looks alike. It was illegal to raise a private monument, and those monuments were removed from all over the world. A few of them have survived in Egypt, but very, very few. And that's interesting, isn't it? It's showing the way that these imperatives acted to codify, if you like, a certain pattern of remembrance. Today, of course, the bodies of soldiers killed overseas are repatriated, and that's of course because there are fewer fatalities, and it's also, I think, because the way we look at that repatriation process has changed. It's no longer the logistical nightmare that it would have been in 1919. Okay. Now, I'm just scanning the list here for more comments. And before I answer the next comment, I might just say something else that I forgot to say about all of the memorials you've been mentioning, and that is what they carry. They carry inscriptions, the glorious dead it might be, for king and country it might be, but they carry something else as well. They carry a name. And that individual process of naming was tremendously important, and it was actually quite new. What do I mean by that? Well, of course, war memorials were built before the First World War, but in most cases they were tributes to martial valour. They commemorated great men in the field, the officer class. They didn't commemorate the individual soldier, the individual nurse, the individual sailor. What's interesting about the pattern of commemoration that emerges from the First World War is that it's a democratic tradition. It acknowledges everyone. Everybody is named, and that imperative to name is tremendously important in those communities because it means that you can go and identify that individual. It becomes, as we've said, a cenotaph, an imaginary grave. I've got a statement now from John. John and his wife several years ago attended a very moving service in Corowa at the site of the WW1 POW outbreak. The cemetery's ringed by eucalyptus and it's set in open farmland. For me, John writes, Anzac Day is about all who suffered in war. Is Cowra the only place for foreign servicemen and women in Australia? I'm just pausing here for a moment to think about that. No, it's certainly not. There were, of course, prisoner of war camps during the First World War as well. In fact, German prisoners of war, you'll find them buried outside of Holsworthy in New South Wales. In some cases, those memorials that were raised to the enemy were destroyed by returned servicemen after the war. And I think it's very important that we acknowledge the hatred that's generated by war. It's not a cosy narrative of reconciliation. It's, in many cases, undying hatred. So you actually had those returned servicemen destroying that particular memorial to German POWs who died in captivity. That's not a universal statement, of course. Many soldiers respected the enemy. But there are those instances as well, and we shouldn't shy away from them. Claire, my favourite memorial in the shrine in Melbourne is a water trough dedicated to horses. Were animals commemorated early, or has that come along later? Thank you, Claire, for that question. Yeah, look, that memorial is quite early itself. It's from what we call the Purple Cross, and that, of course, is dedicated to the animals that serve, particularly horses. If you go to Sydney, immediately outside the Botanic Gardens in Sydney, you'll find a memorial to the horses that were sent overseas, and, of course, very few of those horses return. Most of them are killed, often killed by their men because they couldn't bear the thought of them falling into others' hands after they left them. Now, this pattern of commemorating animals really begins during the First World War, but it's really flourishing today. Pozières is the site of Australia's greatest sacrifice in France. More Australians died in that small plot of ground than anywhere else in the country. And what's interesting about Pozières is right near the windmill site, which was a site of carnage in 1916. It's ringed now by a series of memorials commemorating animals, not just horses either. You have dogs being commemorated. You have all of the animals that served in some capacity during the Great War. And in the centre of London, there's also a memorial to animals. I think the memorial inscription is particularly interesting there. It reads, "They had no choice." But so too, I would remind you, that is true also for the conscript armies that served. They had no choice either. Okay, I have a message from Jocelyn now. What are my thoughts on Australian memorial structures at Villa-Bretonneux? Villa-Bretonneux, the original Villa-Bretonneux Memorial, is a breathtakingly beautiful structure. It's designed by Edward Lutyens, the Imperial War Graves Commission artist and sculptor. It takes the form of a series of colonnades that sweep across the landscape, and also a tower that has commanding views across the surrounding fields. A couple of things to note about this memorial. It's not the first memorial that was actually planned there. The original memorial wasn't planned by a British architect at all. It was planned by an Australian, and indeed the competition that decided on the form the War Memorial at Villa-Bretonneux, the National War Memorial would take, actually specified that the design had to come from an Australian. And even more importantly, it specified that the entire memorial had to be constructed out of Australian stone. Now, you can imagine the expense of that during the Great Depression, carting shipload of stone from Australia to build our national memorial in France. It all proved too expensive, and Lucas's original memorial plans were abandoned, and you get Lutyens Memorial emerging in its place. That's the memorial structure. But what's happened, of course, during the centenary years is that there's an interpretive centre that's been added as an appendage to that. The interpretive centre, I think, there's a kind of irony there. When Lutyens built that memorial, I'm citing the memorial artists themselves, people like Herbert Baker, they argued that what Villa-Bretonneux should be is a place of sanctuary, a place of reflection, a place to mourn, and a place to grieve what they hoped would be the last war in human history. The irony I'm referring to, though, is that what the Australian government has done in the exhibition spaces is it has a virtual recreation of war, simulated battle scenes. You actually have an immersive 3D experience where you sit there and you relive the First World War. And that, I think, well, it's theatrical, it's dramatic, it's very effective. It's also quite disturbing because the original message of that memorial space was it should be a place of peace and reflection. So I do have my reservations about the form that Villa-Bretonneux has taken. And I think actually the saddest thing about the development of that new memorial complex is it's overshadowed another memorial complex, which the people of Villa-Bretonneux themselves initiated. Those of you who visited that corner of France, as we call it, many of you will have visited the local school which acts as a war memorial. And the simple displays that you'll see there are those intimate gestures of remembrance by the community. I think they're far more eloquent than a movie we're showing at Villa-Bretonneux today. I'm looking now through the lists of questions that I've got there. From David, who's from Darwin. Great to have a question from Darwin. Who looks after the graves overseas? Well, David, the short answer is we all do. And what do I mean by that? Well, every Commonwealth nation that fought during the Great War is a signatory to the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. It began, of course, as the Imperial War Graves Commission. It's now called the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. Proportionate to the number of dead, you actually pay a certain fee every year, and that covers the maintenance of war graves overseas. Now, what I think is so remarkable about this is that when these arrangements were set up, and I'm talking not, 1935 or 1945, I'm talking about 1916 when we begin to evolve this whole process. When these arrangements are set up, the phrase that's used is care for these memorials in perpetuity. What does in perpetuity mean? It means forever and ever and ever. And Churchill, when he was arguing for the creation of these great Commonwealth war graves, imperial war graves across the globe, rather than bringing the bodies home, argued that these would be monuments everlasting, that they would last longer than the tombs of the pharaohs. So I don't know whether that is actually going to prove to be the case or not. If you visit war graves today, they are in immaculate condition. They're kept in immaculate condition by all the Commonwealth countries that subscribe to that Commonwealth War Graves Commission fund. I've got a question from Matthew. On a day focused on remembering, what do you think as a nation we're at risk of forgetting? I think there are many things at a nation we have forgotten, sometimes willfully forgotten, in the course of remembering war. I began this broadcast by an acknowledgement to country, and perhaps we should remember the war of dispossession that was fought in our own country as well. Now, the Australian War Memorial is a memorial, yes, it's that, but it is also a museum. It was established as a museum, as an interpretive site, as part of its charter. Part of the charter reads that we will commemorate every conflict in which Australians have fought. Now, by my reading of that, it's not just a First World War memorial. Clearly, it's a Second World War memorial. It commemorates conflicts today. But more than that, it commemorates what they call colonial conflicts. It commemorates the Boer War, the Boxer Rebellion, and so on. If the Australian War Memorial is to commemorate colonial conflicts, it must surely commemorate the conflict that ravaged this country, that cost an uncounted number of Aboriginal dead. You can't willfully turn away from the question of what those wars of dispossession means. And I hope under the new directorship that the War Memorial has, we'll return to these questions. We'll consult Indigenous communities. We'll consult the wider community as well. And we'll have the simple courage and the simple decency to actually ask those very challenging and difficult questions, because that is a willful act of forgetting to excise one part of our history like that. I'm just looking through. Margaret, seems Aboriginal dead being so far from country must be very upsetting. Yes, look, I don't know whether any of you saw the play Black Diggers, Wesley Enoch's brilliant play, which was staged in the course of the centenary. What Wesley did and his team was really quite remarkable. They captured community stories, and one of the very powerful stories they told was of an Aboriginal man whose Indigenous comrade dies with him, his kinsman dies beside him, and he carries the soil that man is buried in home to his community, and that's part of the way that he grieves. And indeed, I know Indigenous people now today are making these pilgrimages to war graves overseas to lay these spirits to rest. So yes, I think the trauma of bereavement affects every community, but for Indigenous communities it must have been particularly strong. And again, not to have that acknowledged properly, I think does those communities a great disservice. Rachel from Canberra, what's my favourite memorial? Oh, a hard question for a historian. I guess I think of my childhood. I grew up in Mornington. Mornington, when I was a child, Mount Martha was very much a country town. There was a little memorial there. It was a cross of sacrifice, interestingly. But at the centre of that cross of sacrifice was Dora Olsen's remarkable sculpture. Now, this is important because so few women actually do sculpt war memorials. That privilege usually falls to men. Indeed, sometimes it's specified that they must be returned servicemen that design these memorials. Dora's sculpture is really quite eloquent. It's a woman nursing a dying man. Now, the way that Dora Olsen described that memorial is that it's allegorical. That woman symbolises Australia nursing the war dead. For me as a child, I always read that as a nurse giving comfort to a man in his final moments. But whatever way you look at it, it's a tremendously eloquent memorial. It's really taken a place in my mind to this day. Well, I think on that note, that personal and rather indulgent note, we'll leave it for today. Before I close, though, I really do want to give my full and fulsome acknowledgement to the team at the Australian National University that's brought this thing together. I thank Susan Beck, of course, and my colleagues at Monash, the National Museum and the ANU, but special thanks to Darren, to Danica, to Adam, to Rachel, to Andrea, to Ivana for pulling this remarkable exercise together, and I look forward to carrying on this conversation soon. Have a safe and a peaceful Anzac Day.